Hello, I'm Thom Hartman. Welcome to this special program about dark money, huge amounts of unregulated and untraceable corporate cash that's pouring into our politics, influencing our elections, and threatening our democracy. Some critics call it government capture. To others, it's the Death Star. But most agree that solving the dark money problem is key to moving forward on a host of other pressing issues. What are the best ways to combat Citizens United, that disastrous 2010 Supreme Court decision that opened the floodgates for corporations to spend unlimited amounts? Are corporations really people? Is money the same as free speech? In the coming hour, we'll discuss tactics, strategies, and possible solutions on local, state, and national levels to the plague of dark money. We'll talk with Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause New York, Rachel Curley from Public Citizens Congress Watch Division, and Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap, National Director of the Move to Amend Coalition. This joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network is coming to you from El Barrio Firehouse Studio in East Harlem, New York. Before hearing from our guests, let's take a look at the ever-growing amount of anonymous dark money that special interests are using to drown out the voices of the rest of us. We'll show you how our political process is increasingly rigged by corporations and the billionaires who control them, and how their shell game works to the benefit of just a few. And we'll look at some proposed solutions to the problem, from public financing of campaigns to legislation requiring disclosure and transparency, perhaps even amending the Constitution itself. Dark money. Hundreds of millions of dollars in unregulated, untraceable corporate cash that influences our elections and elected officials. It's one of the greatest threats to American democracy.
You can't really stop them or regulate them, and limits on any sort of contributions are doomed.
The government of the United States has indeed been captured by big special interests. Unlimited money and its nasty big brother, unlimited dark money, have basically driven Congress into a state of servitude.
Everything we want to achieve as a nation rests in large part on whether we're able to get big money out of politics.
This is like the Death Star. If we can solve the dark money problem, then we can start to win on pharmaceuticals, on Wall Street, on environment, on fossil fuels, on a whole variety of other issues. And that's why they fight so desperately to protect us, because they know it's their Death Star too.
Given the high stakes, it's no surprise that record amounts of dark money are pouring into our elections. One powerful network spent $250 million to influence the 2016 election. It's spending even more on this year's midterm elections, as much as $400 million.
A number of billionaires are flooding our democracy with their money, drowning out the voices of the rest of us. But Charles and David Koch are in a class by themselves.
Between the two of them, Charles and David Koch are worth about $85 billion.
Jane Mayer literally wrote the book about dark money, a bestseller that revealed the hidden history of a network of extremely wealthy conservatives who have worked together to influence academic institutions, think tanks, the courts, state houses, Congress, and the presidency for their own benefit. At its center, the Koch brothers.
They are the owners of the second largest private company in America, Koch Industries. They've got a tremendous kind of unlimited amount of money to spend in American politics, and they've got very extreme views.
They're using their fortune to create their own political machine designed to protect and advance their financial interests.
Here's how it works.
The Koch machine includes political front groups pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into elections at every level of our democracy, while disguising the sources of the money. Giant advertising campaigns to convince Americans climate change is a myth. A network of think tanks designed to come up with findings the Kochs want. A campaign to suppress the votes of minorities.
We instituted a photo ID requirement for every voter.
a nationwide effort to bust unions, a long-term strategy to unravel America's campaign finance laws, even organizing secret meetings with sympathetic Supreme Court justices.
Who allowed this torrent of money to swamp our political system and drown out the voices of citizens? It was the Supreme Court. Over the past 4 decades, the court has knocked down common sense protections against the power of money in our politics.
The Koch political machine is especially dangerous in present-day America, where wealth is more concentrated than it's been in over a century. And the Supreme Court has opened the floodgates to big money.
And Montana's been the leader in campaign finance since 1912.
How did Montana become ground zero for dark money?
If you follow campaign finance issues, if you follow money in politics in the state of Montana, it makes for a really good case study.
Kimberly Reed directed an award-winning documentary about Montana's battle over dark money.
Dark money is about the anonymous groups that are able to move our politics and power in an anonymous, unaccountable way. And we show how that works. We show how that shell game, how that rigged system works.
And so 100 years later, along comes Citizens United.
All right, the breaking news from the Supreme Court now, a ruling just in about the future of election funding. The court ruling...
There will be major changes in the way political campaigns are funded following a landmark Supreme Court ruling today.
We'll hear argument today in case 08205, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission.
You run into all the crucial issues, the size of contribution limits, the disclosure requirements for contributions. If you focus on the state of Montana, it just shows you how these groups game the system. So that's what we did.
When that candidate gets elected, they support the agenda of the corporation.
It's not a problem just in Montana. Montana just seems to be the microcosm for it.
So what happens in Montana is a good case study to show how this works, how this game of whack-a-mole happens, how this shell game is going on all the time.
There are solutions to the plague of dark money, including campaign finance reform, public financing, democracy vouchers, even overturning Supreme Court decisions that corporations are people and money is speech by amending the U.S. Constitution.
This is what every single social movement that has come before us has done when they recognize that the system is really flawed and it's not working and the people in power are not going to self-correct. But it's time for the people to step in, and there's actually a process in our Constitution to do this. This isn't new.
But if citizens take no action to change the role of dark money in American politics, our democratic traditions will remain under threat.
The one thing that you can count on is that dark money spending grows every election cycle.
This is where politicking is going. It's going to be truly the Wild West. The only way our political process is going to change is if people voice their anger.
So Susan Lerner, Common Cause has been around for 50 years.
Just about.
This is not a brand new problem. In fact, we could arguably go back to the senator, the copper senator from Montana with his $1,000 bills. There's a long history of money, corporate money in politics. Can you talk about the size and scope of this problem and what Common Cause is thinking about?
The size and scope of this problem is unfortunately expanding. We've been involved in the last almost 50 years, as you point out, in every single successful attempt to contain the problem, and in particular the U.S. Supreme Court has spent time undoing a lot of what we and other groups like Public Citizen and the citizen activists that we represent across the country have been involved in doing. And that is really to control the outsized impact of political money on policy making. So we have a long history in this country of being skeptical of those who can spend money to gain access and have the ear of policymakers and who are capable through their wealth and their access of pushing public policy in the direction that they want it to go. And the public is rightfully suspicious of that and wants to have it contained. So there's a dynamic tension in our system between the right of free speech and a desire actually to ensure that public policy is based on rational, objective facts and not who can buy the biggest megaphone. And so we've been involved in setting up laws that would restrict the amount of money which a candidate could spend. Well, that was done away with by the Supreme Court. We've worked hard to get campaign contribution limits so that no one really wealthy person would have an opportunity to buy access and the ear and the policy that they want. Well, that was interfered with by the Supreme Court. And, you know, we've been actively involved in helping to inform the public with the idea that if you at least know who's trying to buy access and more speech, then you can be more skeptical about the positions that they're taking. That is also difficult to do in the current state of the law. So what we have is a situation where we've been working along with interested members of the public, which now number in the millions, to try and be sure that our system of checks and balances actually works and that the people's voice isn't overspoken and drowned out by wealthy special interests. And right now, with a very conservative court, the court and unfortunately one very retrogressive political party is doing everything they can to undercut that public will to control the outsized influence of money in politics. And it's gotten really bad because U.S. Supreme Court decisions have encouraged secret spending. And that becomes very, very pernicious because it's very hard for candidates to defend against literally limitless amounts of money coming from secret sources.
Now we've had moments in our past, Susan, where it's kind of awakened people to what's going on. Krista Freeland's book, Plutocrats, I believe is the book, starts with the story of a giant party here in the late 19th century in New York City that basically brought the wrath of the common person down on the plutocrats. There was the Copper King that I was talking about earlier, who stood outside the chamber and said, anybody who votes for me gets a $1,000 bill, passed them out, was sent to the U.S. Senate.
Right, the
Senate refused.
Standard Oil, right?
Yeah.
Comes from the Gilded Age as well,
right.
in the sense that they're bought.
Right, but the Senate refused to seat him when he came to Washington, D.C., and that created a kind of political explosion. And arguably these things together led to the Tillman Act in 1907 or 1909.
Right, and yeah, the restriction on corporate treasury money and then later union treasury money being used for political contributions with the idea that political actors in our system ought to be natural persons.
Right, so the question in the context of that setup is, you named a number of different things that you're working on. Do you see any of these as being those kind of, you know, the flame that the match that ignites the flame kind of thing?
Well, first of all, I think we don't need a match to incite the flame of public opinion right now. We've done a great job of convincing the public that there's a problem. I think poll after poll, politician after politician from the left and the right are attacking the huge amount of money in our system. What we really need to do is to explain to the public that there are some workable solutions and that we need to apply them to protect the strength of our democracy, small d democracy, and to be sure that all voices are heard and have a good chance to be persuasive in our system. Otherwise, we don't have a democracy.
Amen. And we'll get through the course of this conversation, we will be getting to some of those solutions. It's a great setup. Thank you. Rachel, you're with Public Citizen. Public Citizen is not only doing advocacy work, you're also assisting other organizations to do that. What kind of resources are you bringing to the table, and what do you see? And feel free to respond or add to, you know, all the things that Susan was talking about.
Yeah, so much great stuff to respond to, Susan. Yeah, so Public Citizen, we also have citizen members. We have about 400,000 members at Public Citizen, and so we similarly are hoping to keep people engaged and informed about what's going on with the problem of secret money in our elections. We also work with sort of a unique constituency, which is investors investors and securities experts who are actually concerned about particularly the problem of corporate money and how companies are taking advantage of these loopholes to be spending money, sort of circumventing the traditional rules to spend that money in our elections, and thinking about ways that we can work to constrain that, or to bring it, really more importantly, to bring it into the light. And one way that we could do that is have the SEC make a rule on that. But I also think, to Susan's point about sort of igniting this flame, I think to be honest, the Trump administration has really shown what happens when a government is captured by these corporate interests. I think folks see the, 16 investigations against Scott Pruitt and say, oh, I get it. All right, this is what happens when you have somebody who is solely beholden to industry in a cabinet position.
But ironically, in the administration of a so-called populist who ran against big money,
yes,
right,
Sure.
which is
Right.
what is always most kerfuffling about our current situation.
Yeah,
Right.
he was like, I'm going to raise my own taxes. You know, it's going to be tough for us billionaires.
Right, exactly. Nobody can buy me because I'm already rich already, and I'm going to drain the swamp. And instead, he comes in, and the people he puts in are the Scott Pruitts of the world.
It is so swampy.
So you were
PC.
talking about being a public citizen and your role in this.
Yeah, and so we are certainly supporting legislative fixes to secret money in politics. We're certainly in favor of overturning Citizens United, and so we have folks who lobby on the Hill on those bills, and then we, again, like I said, keep folks informed about what they can do to take action on this topic.
It's important stuff. It's really important stuff. Kaitlin, Move to Amend, a great organization. You and I and the organization go way back to its beginning.
We do.
Talk about amending the Constitution. I realize this is kind of solution stuff that I want to get to toward the end, but by way of introducing you and your organization, where did it Move to Amend come from? What are the issues that you're trying to address? And broadly speaking, why the focus on that word amend?
Susan, I think, set it up nicely in going through these legislative solutions that exist and could be put in place, but unfortunately the Supreme Court has systematically dismantled them and ruled them unconstitutional. And so basically the only way to put the court in its place is to amend the Constitution, to make clear this is what the Constitution says, this is our position on money in politics, say, and therefore it takes it out of the hands of the court to interpret and in our hands to define. And so Move to Amend is a campaign to amend the Constitution. We were launched publicly on the day of the Citizens United decision, but our work goes back before that, really focusing more on the idea that corporations have constitutional rights or corporate personhood. And so our amendment, the We the People amendment, is a solution that would kind of, for once and for all, address the two underlying doctrines that made Citizens United possible, that were both concocted by corporate lawyers and the Supreme Court together. The idea that corporations have constitutional rights and the idea that money is spending money in politics is protected by the First Amendment and part of the First Amendment. And so we see those two pieces as essential. If we're going to amend the Constitution, we should do it in the most systemic way possible, the most lasting solution that gets us the best platform on which to build these legislative solutions that already exist, that many other countries use, or that we've already had in place in this country at the federal level or at the state level, but that the court has said are out of bounds of our ability to implement as long as corporations have constitutional rights and money is speech. And so that's why we have to roll back those two doctrines and make clear that the Constitution is meant to protect human rights for people. Corporations should have rights and protections under the law, but those should come through the legislative process. And corporations that are acting outside of their authority and causing harm in our politics or in our communities in other ways, we need to be able to regulate them. We need to be able to do something about that behavior. And it's really not just elections. Yes, of course, in Citizens United and McCutcheon, we're just seeing this money pouring in, and so that is at the fore in the conversation now, and that's the bulk of what this program is about. But the reality is that corporations are influencing our politics in other ways too. When communities or states, and in the case of Citizens United, the federal government passes legislation meant to protect the public in some way, not just in the electoral realm, but say the environment or workers or just communities' ability to define themselves, we see time and again corporations sue those communities or those states and make the argument that those laws are violating their constitutional rights in some way, not just their First Amendment rights, but their 14th Amendment rights or their Fourth Amendment rights. And again, that ties our hands and makes it impossible for us to meaningfully regulate these enormous financial actors in the political realm and the electoral realm. And so while many of us have worked on other democracy-related issues, we're really just trying to focus on the amendment as the solution, because at the end of the day, if we don't have an amendment, then any legislation that we try to put forward, any acts that we try to put forward, any regulation that we go for stands to be overturned again by the Supreme Court. And I think we're going to be facing another generation or more of an incredibly conservative court. And the only kind of mechanism that we have to check the court is to amend the Constitution. And so I think that it's very clear that at this point that it's gone out of control and we need to rein it back in. And the only way to do that is through an amendment.
And the basic concepts that we're talking about in these amendments are incredibly popular with the public. I mean, they pull off the charts when you ask voters, if you ask citizens, do you feel that corporations have constitutional rights? The idea is farcical to most people. And if you ask people, do you believe that a very wealthy person or a corporation should be able to buy enough speech so that nobody can hear you? They'll tell you no, they don't think that's fair, that there should be a right not only to speak, but to be heard.
And it doesn't matter what political perspective people have.
Correct.
Conservatives agree with this as well, rank and file conservatives. I mean, the leadership of the Republican Party, not as much, right? I mean, they're leading the way in this charge, right? Yeah. But the regular Republican or conservatives, moderates, decline to states, and progressives, all are in agreement on this. In the 80 percentiles, we've passed ballot initiatives all over the country. All of our organizations have been involved in that, and we've seen that they always win, often by landslides, even in conservative places.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
exactly, like Montana.
Yeah,
in 2012.
I was at a cocktail party in Washington, D.C. with Grover Norquist and a number of Republican members of Congress, and I got in this conversation with two of them about this issue and said, well, if there was legislation that, for example, using Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 2, that says that that the Supreme Court shall operate under regulations established by Congress and that legislation can be exempted from judicial review by Congress. If something like that came out of Congress, if that was before you tomorrow, that would end all this dark money, what would you do? What would you think? And both of them said, don't tell anybody in this party. Don't tell anybody I told you this. But I would vote for that tomorrow morning because the worst part of my job is spending 5 hours a day on the damn phone begging for money.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Congress people who in private places would admit that. It'd be nice if they would vote accordingly and support these movements in that
Well,
case,
they don't have a piece of legislation.
Right, we need
now,
to, well, there's an amendment in
that's
Congress.
actually not true. There's plenty of
Go for it.
legislation. That's just that they are unable politically or for their own self-interest financially to actually stand up on their hind legs and do what their constituents want. That's the problem with the system right now. It is self-perpetuating in a particularly negative and damaging way that really undercuts people's faith in a representational government.
Rachel, do you think that it's that these politicians are afraid to defy the people who essentially own them, who owe their political careers to them?
Yeah, I think the threat of a dark money challenge to a politician is incredible. I think if they, if someone from an industry or a special interest comes to them and says, hey, if you're going to vote on that bill, we've got resources that we can apply to your next campaign, that's very threatening and absolutely would make someone fall in line.
And clearly corrupting, contrary to the nonsense that you see behind the non-logic behind the Citizens United decision.
Well, in a way, that's the beauty of this issue, though, too, and why everyone agrees, because it's actually just common sense. The two principles are such common sense. One, obviously corporations are not people, and two, obviously spending millions of dollars to influence an election means that there's going to be a payoff and that there is corruption. And it doesn't take, any kind of political scientist or a corporate constitutional or a constitutional scholar, to understand that that's true. It's just so common sense, and that's the frustration of we're in this predicament and there's really no reason to be here. There's no good argument for why we should have the money that we have, in the political process, and why that's not resulting in a very small class of people having the say over our government and the rest of us just left out.
Unless, Jimmy Carter was on my radio program a couple years back, and he said, we're no longer a functioning democracy, we are now a plutocracy, ruled by the rich. Clearly. So I want to get into that when we come back from this on this topic. In a moment, we'll discuss how dark money is a gateway issue, one that must be resolved before other important concerns can be addressed, from the environment to racism to growing inequality. We'll also examine in depth the range of possible solutions to the problem. I'm Thom Hartman, and you're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Welcome back. Let's talk about the history of corporate money, and for that matter, billionaire money. Billionaire is a more recent term, but Rockefeller's wealth was not that different from the Koch brothers' wealth, I believe, if you were to inflation adjust it. So, whether it's vast private wealth, or whether it's corporate wealth that generates that. Kaitlin, I'd like to start with you. You teach democracy classes on this all around the country. You've got this 60-foot long timeline of all the Supreme Court decisions that led to this. I realize it's a complex, in a way, it's a complex subject. There's a lot there, but there's also there's a skeleton to this body that's fairly easily defined. Can you lay this out for us?
I think the most important thing that we understand is that this didn't just happen. This isn't a reflection of the current Supreme Court and a current moment of corruption. This is a path that we have been on, unfortunately, as a country for quite some time. It's not an accident, I don't think, that the idea that corporations have constitutional rights came out of the robber baron era, the most corrupt time in our country's history, except for maybe now. And at this point I would say, except for definitely now. You had this height of a moment where the Standard Oil and the railroad industries of the day were able to use their wealth and influence to change the core fundamental law to make it easier for them to own our democracy. And we had some pushback following that, but it's really important, I think, for us to think as big as the other side does. If we're talking about the progressive path forward, I think part of the problem is that we don't vision systemic solutions. We kind of react and respond to the systemic and deep plans on the part of the right, and instead of putting forward our lasting solutions. And so I think that's part of the piece, is that it's actually been a very methodical effort on their part to look at the doctrines that were getting in the way of their ability to influence the political process unfairly, and they got rid of them. And so the idea that corporations could be regulated and controlled through state legislatures and regulations at that level, that they did away with that by interpreting corporations to have constitutional rights. And then jump forward to the 70s is sort of where the money and politics piece started, with the Buckley decision that interpreted spending money in the political process to be exercising First Amendment rights. And so if corporations are people, then they have First Amendment rights. And so then government is not able to limit their spending in elections. And and they want to go further and also say that our requirements to make donors disclose who they are so we know where the money is coming from. They want to make the argument that that's a violation of the First Amendment. And so I think it's really important that, that we think big. We can think about the incremental steps that need to be taken right away, but we also need to think about the foundation that needs to be set. Again, that's why we focus on the amendment piece, because that's really where those kinds of foundational principles get put. I mean, we also need a constitutional right to vote in the Constitution. It needs to say that we have a right to vote and our vote is counted, and we don't have that in this country either. But I think the lesson that I take from history is that these billionaires thought very big. I mean, part of that is they have the resources to do that. You can make a big plan and then you can implement it when you have billions of dollars. But we have the people power, and we have the common sense and the right solution that people want. And so I think we can do the same, and we need to be visionary and come at it from that angle as well. But understanding that the idea that money is speech goes all the way back to the 1970s. That didn't come from Citizens United. Citizens United built on that initial interpretation of the Constitution. And then same thing with corporate constitutional rights, going back 130 plus years, actually.
So a lot of people identify the beginning of this as the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case of 1886. And will even point to President Grover Cleveland's State of the Union address the next year, in which he said, as we see these, I'm paraphrasing this badly, but as we see these combinations and trusts emerge, the iron heel of the corporate master is upon the neck of the average person. I mean, he actually said that in his State of the Union address right after that decision. Was that really that pivotal a point? I mean, back in Dartmouth in 1814, there was an acknowledgement of corporate rights by the Supreme Court. So there is a larger arc to this, but can you speak to those?
Well, I mean, there's been a push all along, right? Because of our framework, where the idea is that, people have rights and individual, sovereignty, and government has, responsibilities. And because corporations are creatures of government, it's properly understood that they should have those same responsibilities and ability to be regulated. And so there has been an eyeing of that on the part of the corporate elite going all the way back to say, if we could kind of get ourselves in the Constitution, what would that bring us? But also, I just want to point out that 1886, that's also the year of the Haymarket Massacre. The, Das Kapital was published for the first time in English. I mean, the populist movement was going strong in this country, putting forward all kinds of regulations on corporations at the state level and amending state constitutions to try and put them back in the box. And so you had a tremendous moment of upheaval in those late 1800s, and literally in that year, I think similar to right now, the country was in crisis, and unfortunately, I think that case and that moment was sort of the beginning of, not the end, because we've had other moments where we kind of pushed back, but this is a pendulum, and what it shows too is that when it goes too far afield, there does become this need to correct, and we are certainly, well past that point, and that's why, again, I think it's important that we think visionary and big, and I think people are ready for that, because they are it's the same as in the moment in the late 1800s where the robber barons and the railroad industry was just had people with their boots on their neck, and you could have a presidential candidate say that, and that would resonate.
Well, it's sort of what Donald Trump.
That's right.
Right. Yes.
That's exactly
yes. Well,
right.
and
he appealed to that.
Right, and he did. And unfortunately, I think on the left we didn't in the same way. And so we have to recognize that people are frustrated and upset, and for very good reason. And we need to make sure that who is responsible for what the problem that we're in is directed. And that's why it's so important that we understand the Kochs and the huge influence that they have,
and
the shady behind the scenes.
Are, which is basically to ensure that the majority never gets to rule.
Right. Well, and what's interesting about the Koch brothers, lots is interesting about the Koch brothers, but in
a negative
negative way. Yeah, don't get too excited.
Bad.
Right. Professor Nancy McLean has a new book out, Democracy in Chains, where she talks about, she discovered a treasure trove of information about the type of economic policy that they have built their machine around. And one thing that she talks about is so important is understanding that they know their ideas are not popular. They know that they have to go underground and in the shadows in order to rig the rules. And I find that very inspirational when I think about what we can say to folks who are worried about this problem. Right. We actually have incredible ideas, and we have the ideas that people in general are in favor of. One person, one vote. Corporations are a piece of paper. They're not people. And the Koch brothers know that, which is why they've hidden their influence in the shadows.
The really corrosive impact of dark money and how it has definitely been, I think, one of their goals is to be able to spend huge amounts of money to influence public opinion sometimes at the very most local level, school board elections, municipal elections, and how to have people understand who it is who is coming from outside trying to influence their lives with huge amounts of money and a blind adherence to an extraordinary, narrow and corrosive philosophy that they always know better and none of us should really have a say. And that's what's really fascinating about Nancy's book, is that it really gives us a framework for what seems to be all of these abstract and scattershot things that are happening, because they're all in the service of a philosophy that says the elite who have all of the money know best, no one should interfere with them or their ability to make more money, and for sure we shouldn't have to listen to all of those unwashed masses who think that they should have a say. And the dark money aspect feeds very, very directly into that, because when people do know where the money is coming from, they get upset. They do not like the idea that somebody is coming in, I think, to Lexington, Kentucky, with huge amounts, multiple millions, money that just had not been seen in municipal elections, to tell the Kentuckians, the Lexonians, who they should vote for. And there is a pushback once people know who's trying to take over their school board, who's trying to elect a particular mayor or people on the city council who have no skin in the game, no local presence whatsoever, but just a philosophy that says, we know better than everybody else and we're going to use our money to step on you.
Yeah.
Well, and unfortunately, I think that we think of that Koch and billionaire attitude as not being American, but unfortunately, many of our founders held that same belief, that the rest, the rabble, the masses at the gate, the mob at the gate, that's what democracy is. And so I think that's one of the things too that we need to grapple with as a country, that a lot of this is the legacy of beginning a country rooted in slavery and genocide and stealing property from the people who are here, turning human beings into property. And so it's not an accident that we end up in a situation where corporations, which are property, have more rights than the rest of us. And the other piece too, I just want to add in, is that, yes, the money, it shows time and time again that public opinion can be swayed by false advertising, and that's a huge problem with the dark money. But they also have systematically dismantled access to vote, and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court 5 years ago is a huge part of the problem as well, because I think we can't give the idea that the problem is just that the public, is just sort of like beholden to whatever they see in the media and they'll just do whatever. A lot of it is that people who know better are not given access, and then of course we also don't often have candidates that make people excited to turn out and vote.
Right.
So all of these things go together and they understand all of that and use all of that against us.
Right, and push it relentlessly. But there are still some parts of the country like New York where we don't have any of the election reforms, our allegedly progressive state. And we have some of the most lax campaign contribution limits in the entire country. And that combination is extraordinarily toxic. And what you see is a situation where we are close to the bottom in terms of voter turnout, because people get discouraged. They look at the situation.
It's also very difficult to vote in New York.
It's extremely difficult to register and vote. And good luck figuring out when our primary elections are, because they change all the time. We're the only state which has that has 2 primaries, because we can't figure out how to hold our congressional primary at the same time as our state legislative primary. So we pay double, and we confuse everybody, and we depress turnout, and incumbents like that.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
I think Rachel, your organization has been around for roughly 50 years. You've seen the ebb and flow, not you personally, but
I am a millennial.
the ebb and flow of this in the context of politics. And FDR famously said, they hate me and I welcome their hatred. And he said these economic royalists hate me. He was speaking directly about the billionaire class. Al Fromm wrote a book in 90, I think it was, about how he had put together this DLC thing that because Reagan had wiped out the unions and a funding source for the Democratic Party, that they were going to go to the clean industries, to the banks and the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies and start getting their money from them. And so we've seen this kind of corruption of both parties. To what extent is this partisan now, and to what extent is it pushing the two political parties?
Well, I think we were touching about this earlier, and so not to totally reiterate points we've already made, but just talking about the polling in terms of how it breaks down on party lines. It's the idea that our government is captured by big money interests is certainly understood by both Republicans and Democratic voters, and they see the problem as getting worse, and so are clearly aware of the significant impact of this problem. I think Democrats at the federal level have been leaders on introducing legislation that would decrease money in politics. But I think what is important to remember is that the ideas around transparency and the fact that voters should be able to see and understand where a candidate is coming from and who is supporting them are fundamentally American and fundamentally nonpartisan. And so I think that's what we have to continue to focus on, is that it's not a party issue to espouse transparency. That's something that both parties can get behind.
But that's a starting point. As your point, that we need to have the long-range vision, and there are many steps along the way that we need to take. And now we are seeing the success of candidates who have the courage to step forward, like Ocasio-Cortez, and say, I'm not taking any political money, and I have a clear position, and I'm going to state it, and nobody's going to move me off it. And money in politics is a problem. We need public financing of elections, and we need a progressive agenda.
And once again, there's a broad consensus among the American people, both Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated, that that's a good thing. So it seems like we should be able to go in this direction. We'll see how this goes. We'll be back in a moment to discuss the implications of dark money for the coming midterms. We'll also highlight some candidates who are taking the lead by refusing all corporate donations. What are some actions you can take to support them? What is the best path forward for progressives as we approach the crucial midterm elections? I'm Thom Hartman, and you're watching a joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Let's talk solutions.
Yes.
There's a wide variety of solutions. Kaitlin has spoken rather eloquently to amending the Constitution. I would like to get into a conversation about the debate that's happening on the left about whether the appropriate way to do that is to hold a Constitutional Convention, open the whole thing up, let's rewrite it, which, by the way, the Koch brothers are pushing for, versus another path. We also have the idea of democracy vouchers. There's the idea of public financing of campaigns, and no doubt there are others. Susan, you want to start with this?
Sure. I mean, while we work towards this essential and aspirational goal, there are a lot of things that we can be doing along the way. You've touched on some of them. I'd like to go back to disclosure. We really need to deal with disclosure of online communications. We need to have better controls and transparency regarding social media advertising, and we should not be relying on Facebook to decide what that's going to look like. We absolutely need to have legislation along those lines. We have had very successful public financing systems in this country. And again, the U.S. Supreme Court has rolled it back, right? Full public financing of elections worked really well in Arizona, really well in Maine. And then the Supreme Court decided that it was working too well and basically took out important parts of it. So now we've got a hybrid system in Connecticut. It's a combination of matching funds and outright grants that's made a really significant difference in the legislature there. Here in New York City, we have the best that you can do under the current law, which is a matching fund system. So city candidates get $6 for every dollar that they raise up to a maximum, right? So small dollar donations are emphasized and encouraged under a matching fund system. And what that does is it opens up the ballot to a wide diversity of people who really are community-based, who don't have wealthy friends, but can go out and find somebody who will give them $10 or $25, and that $10 is worth $60, and all of a sudden they have $70 where they started with 10. So it's diversified our New York City's elected officials, and it's really helped to control the negative impact of large dollars, because we also have significant campaign contribution limits. And in New York City, we have a lower limit for people and entities that are doing business with the city, which is where you get the real corruption. So if you're a city contractor, then your campaign contribution limit is many times lower than that of a natural person who's a resident. So things we can do.
Has New York been successful in getting around, Susan, the problem of dark money? I mean, the focus of this program?
Well, actually, we have had a more limited dark money problem because of the public financing system. It means that the person you're attacking, the candidate you're attacking, actually can respond. Because the problem with dark money is it comes in heavy, and then individual donors get skittish, particularly the larger donors. Right. They say, oh my God, some PAC has come in, they bought $1 million of TV time, I've only got so much money, I don't want to give $250 to somebody who's going to lose, when in the next district there's somebody I think could win, so I'm going to give him or her my $250, and the person who's under attack suddenly finds that they don't have the wherewithal to respond. Public financing system, we see exactly the opposite. Small dollar donors get very angry when the large secret money comes in, and they contribute more. That's matched by the public, and the candidate who's under attack has a fair chance to get his or her word out to the voter to counter the dark money.
We had in Portland, Oregon a decade ago a system where if you could get, as I recall, 1,000 signatures and 1,000 $5 contributions, right, you immediately got $100,000 from the city, and then
full public financing.
Right, and then for every dollar that was spent by your opponent, the city would match that. And the way it worked in the first election that happened, and I was living there at the time, was that the good guy, the Democrat, and not to say that all Democrats are good guys, right, and all good guys are Democrats, but nonetheless, he was a good guy. He spent the money, and the woman he was running against was actually a lobbyist for what used to be Enron, as I recall. And every time they dumped another $25,000 into her campaign, it became front page news in the newspaper, because the taxpayers are going to have to cough up another 25 grand, which caused her to lose the election. But then
Supreme Court.
Well, it wasn't just the Supreme Court; it was the right-wing media in Portland. You've got several right-wing stations running right-wing all the time, with a very, very popular and prominent right-wing host. They just went to war on this thing, and got it repealed.
Yeah.
So how resilient is that?
Well, no system is absolutely resilient, but Arizona, there were attempts to change the full public financing system, the clean money system there. Maine, same thing. What really undercut it was the Supreme Court, because what you need in a full public financing system is you need the ability to respond to those who spend more. And the Supreme Court said you can't do it, because it might chill the money that's being spent, which is equated to speech, because of the challenger. Which again is a totally counterintuitive, kind of crazy idea that because you can defend yourself, somebody won't talk. This is the problem that we have, that the illogic of the Supreme Court decisions. They have to really twist and turn to come up with ways in which to keep the public money that people want to have supporting campaign finance down. Now we've got a new and good idea in Seattle, which is a voucher. And this everybody gets. You don't have to raise money. The candidate, every single person who's a voter gets a voucher, which is X amount of money that you can only spend by contributing it like a check to the candidate of your choice. And what that does, similar to the matching fund system, is it diversifies the donors. More people contribute, and it helps community-based candidates who don't have access to wealthy donors to actually be able to mount a successful campaign. It doesn't entirely eliminate private money. Matching funds don't entirely eliminate private money, which is why you need very significant campaign contribution limits, but it has a very healthy impact on our democracy.
That's remarkable.
Well,
Rachel?
following up on the Seattle point, thinking about it from the Seattle voter perspective, they have a lot of great testimonials coming out of Seattle where people talk about how they feel so empowered. If they didn't, they never saw themselves participating in Seattle elections before, and then a voucher comes in the mail and they're like, this is amazing, I'm going to go spend this on the candidate that I'm really excited about. And so it does, of course, allow for more diversity in the candidates, but then also allows for increased participation and empowerment for the voters as well. So Seattle's a really exciting place right now.
And we'd like to see a match. We'd like to see a melding of that system in New York City, because what we hear from candidates who come from poor neighborhoods, from low-income neighborhoods, is that they feel guilty going out and asking people for $5 or $10 when they know how difficult things are for some of their constituents. Well, you can get over that if what you're getting is a voucher. Right. And then you can be sure that your support is coming from your constituents, which we think is actually the healthiest kind of support.
Rachel, what are the things that you and your organization are the most excited about?
So one piece, I think, we've talked a lot about the constitutional amendment, which of course is going to, be one of the most significant ways in tackling dark money. But one place that Public Citizen is focusing on a lot, and I think I've mentioned this before, is this particular problem of corporate money, and trying to shine as much light on that as we can so we can really understand where that's coming from. And so it seems a little in the weeds, but we're looking at all the agencies that have the ability to do something about that, and the Securities and Exchange Commission is one. That's the agency that regulates public companies. And the SEC could require companies to disclose this information. They could just put that in their proxy statement. And so that's one area that we've been focusing, again, as an attempt to get at least shining as much light as we can on the problem of dark money where we can.
This is the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Correct.
To what extent are they subject to or suffering from what's referred to as regulatory capture?
Yeah, well, so...
And maybe you want to explain what that means.
Sure. Well, so that means that, the agency is also beholden to special corporate interests. In the case of the SEC, we've actually seen interference from Congress, which is particularly frustrating. So members of Congress, and we don't know who, have inserted a provision into the must-pass spending bill. So this is the bill that must be passed by Congress every year. If someone has inserted language that says that the SEC can't finalize this rulemaking. So someone has been paying attention to the fact that the SEC could require companies to disclose. They could shine light on at least a portion of this dark money, and they've gone and again tried to rig the system using Congress as an option.
Because if shareholders actually knew what their money was being spent on, they could push back. It's very ironic. All of these people who are about the marketplace and capitalism is so great, and the shareholders, are the owners of the company. Well, don't give them the information they need to actually protect their investment. Because they might actually try and do that.
Well, because if a company is spending in politics, in theory, towards the advancement of the bottom line, why wouldn't they share that information with their shareholders? And that's the key question. And to your point, shareholders actually have been asking public companies to disclose their political spending for about a decade, and they've been doing that sort of at the company, at the individual level, filing shareholder resolutions, and have seen a lot of success. I will say about half of the S&P 100 are disclosing their political activities. So what I will say in terms of what folks who are watching can think about doing is keeping up pressure on public companies to be honest about their political spending. We've seen instances where it's come forth that a company has been doing something, shall we call it a bit shady. We might refer to the instance of AT&T and the payments from Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, and that created a huge backlash in the press for AT&T. And so companies, I think right now, are particularly sensitive to how they're being perceived, and this seems like a really key moment for the public to continue to ask them for this information and push them to be honest.
And then there's the giant axe, right? The giant tractor that can plow through all of this, which is just saying to the Supreme Court, sorry guys, we're changing the rules of the game. We're going to amend the Constitution.
We're not changing the rules of the game. We're clarifying.
Yes,
what the
that's
Thank
true.
you very
That's
much.
true.
Thank you
That's
very
true.
much.
They're the ones who've changed the
They've
rules.
changed the rules. We aren't
point,
looking
Susan.
to
Bless you.
change
Thank you for that. There's a debate about this. Larry Lessig and I got into this back 7 or 8 years ago here in New York, and I don't think he's talked to me since then. What do you think are the best ways to accomplish this?
Well, let me just back up for 1 second to say that from Move to Amend's perspective, because viewers out there might be thinking like, amend the Constitution, that seems so hard, you know, especially it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, right? With all the dark money, how can we possibly make these kinds of changes? And so our perspective is we need to build a movement. The only way that we're going to be able to force Congress to act or have a successful constitutional convention, should that be what ultimately is necessary, is to build a movement. And so just a couple things on the movement building front for moving the amendment forward that people can do. You know, this year, election year, it's very important that we get all of the candidates to pledge to amend. All progressives need to be officially taking, you know, whether it's our pledge or making clear that they support an amendment and that they will work for it and that they actually will make it happen, whether they're in Congress or at the state level, because state legislatures are going to have to ratify the amendment. And the reality is this is a longer term fight. So actually people who are running for city council right now are probably the ones who are more likely to be in state legislatures when we come to that ratification moment, or maybe even in Congress. So starting really early with everyone who's running for office to say, if you want to represent the people, you need to pledge to support this amendment and you need to tell us what your position is. And so that's one of the things. And then also, not so much this year, there's a lot of focus on candidates, but one of the tactics that we have used all along is running local ballot initiatives where, you know, the public tells our, you know, congressional members and our state legislature, you know, where we stand and that we want to see this amendment happen. And so there's a mandate from voters as well, which folks need. And so those are a couple things that that we ask people to participate in right now, so it's not just something on down the road.
And let's underestimate what an activated populace can do. Back in the early 70s when the Vietnam War was going on and 18-year-olds felt, you know, left out because you had to be 21 to vote. That amendment, that constitutional amendment, was introduced in the spring and was ratified in the fall of the same year.
Public opinion can be very strong.
Yeah. So our job, our collective job, and your job, all of our jobs, is to be a part of that public opinion, right? To awaken.
In an active way, right?
Yeah.
Not just, I mean, it's important to talk about it because so much of it is that people don't know. You know, thank goodness for media like Free Speech TV, so that people can know what's going on. But even more than just talking about it, you know, actively getting involved. And do you still want me to answer the question really quickly about the Constitutional Convention, or are we out of time?
We got about 15 seconds.
Oh, that's okay. I can't do it in that much time. Let's not go there. But we need to build a movement either way.
Yeah. But
We can leave it at that.
movement building is really the
Right,
key.
and that's involvement. That's showing up, that's asking questions, that's writing letters to the editor in local newspapers.
Or running for office
Or
ourselves.
running for office.
Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Precisely.
We're just about out of time, so please join me in thanking our guests on this joint production of Free Speech TV and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you, Susan Lerner, for your years of work promoting clean campaign cash. Thank you, Rachel Curley, for maintaining Public Citizen's longtime focus on campaign financial disclosure. And thank you, Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap, for moving to amend our Constitution to establish that money is not speech and that human beings, not corporations, are the actual persons entitled to constitutional rights. From the Manhattan Neighborhood Network's El Barrio Firehouse Studio in East Harlem, New York, I'm Thom Hartman. Thank you for watching this edition of our series, Elections 2018, The Progressive Path Forward.